comfort of your own home. That's Chariot Pizza, home of the Italian food reminiscent of Italy and voted Best Pizza of Tucson.
Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 2919 East Broadway. This is a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you live on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download all of our free, all of our live local shows, including Solomon on Blast and the Jim Parisi Show, and the Jake Feinberg Show as well. We thank you for making us part of your day today, and I'm pretty excited because my next guest is a guy that I've been coveting for a long time, since Joe Olivero put him on the roadmap. He's an archivist and a jazzer and a guy who has been instrumental in cultivating jazz studies at the prestigious Stanford University. Not always an easy thing to do. Jim Nadel, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Wow, all right. Well, pleasure to talk with you.
You too, brother. Can you talk a little bit about this? There was such a seismic shift in art as a profession, between really Carter and Reagan. And from my research, you really started this sort of, avant-garde is the wrong word, but can you talk about how you started the jazz studies program at Stanford in the late 70s and ultimately what that looked like originally and how Stan got involved?
Sure. So this would be actually early 70s. I had been studying at the university, and I was pursuing jazz studies. This was something that was dear to my heart, and I graduated and was thinking, what's some way that I could continue my jazz education? Because at Stanford, I had studied classical harmony and learned the difference between Mozart and Haydn and this kind of thing. And but on the side, I was playing jazz all the time, and so I wanted to continue that. And I started an organization called the Stanford Jazz Workshop, and it was basically a community-based organization, very small, local. But the idea was that on Monday nights, right in the center of campus, there was the Stanford Coffee House. It was about a year old, and I had played some jazz there. So I started a Monday night jam session, which is no big deal. Monday nights are historically, at that time, there were a lot of jam sessions happening on Monday nights because the theaters were dark and a lot of musicians were off and they could go out and sit in and hang out. So I started one at Stanford. What was different was because I knew the university scene, having just graduated, I booked a room at the Student Union, which was next door, actually upstairs, and I invited any musicians that were interested to come back on Tuesday night and just hang out and talk about the music, talk about what tunes to practice for the next Monday night, what we might do. We listened to some sides. Back then there was vinyl. We talked about approaches to chord changes. We talked about what chords they might use on the bridge of a tune. And, it was just an open exchange of information. A trumpet player might say, I'm thinking about this when I get to the end of the form, and someone else might say, well, this is what I'm thinking about. And it was just an open conversation, and people came, and it sort of informed the next week jam session. And that idea of hands-on performance and open exchange of information sort of became the basis of the Stanford Jazz Workshop. It continued, and the other thing I had to offer was I had a knowledge of Western classical music theory. And so a lot of what was going down harmonically, I understood in a broader context. It wasn't that new. Maybe the extensions of the dominant chords were very fresh and new to jazz, and maybe the polyrhythms, were something that classical music didn't really appreciate at that time. But the basics of how harmony works, were something I could contribute, and I could see the bigger picture of how Western harmony is the same thing, really. Bebop and Bach are really based on the same concepts of harmonic tension and release. um, so anyway, that grew for some time, and after about 9 or 10 years, it got to be a pretty stable community organization called the Stanford Jazz Workshop. But I had an idea, and which was, maybe perhaps the one good idea I had in my life, which is that jazz music, there's not one correct way to play it. You have examples of people from all different frames of mind, from all different balances of intellect and emotion. Some people play from the heart and just sing. Other people think mathematical patterns. You have examples of people from all different approaches being successful. And so there's not one correct way to play it. And so that makes sense that there would not be one correct way to teach it. So my idea was that if you could have a community where many different approaches to music were represented, it could be from trad jazz, Dixieland to avant-garde. It could be young people, old people. It could be Latin jazz. It could be funk jazz. It could be swinging mainstream jazz. If you could have a community where so many different points of view came together, you would get some really interesting music played, but you'd also have an environment where a student could wander around and sort of pick their influences. They could talk to people. They could exchange ideas and say, well, I like what this person's doing here. I like what this guy's doing here. I like a little bit of what this gal's doing here. And they could sort of find their own voice rather than have one prescriptive way that we teach the music. So this was an idea I had, and I wanted to develop that and build a jazz community representing all kinds of people. And I had heard I was reading in the newspaper. There was a I don't want to say gossip, but there was kind of a gossip columnist out here named Herb. We'll get back to Herb in a minute.
Mm-hmm. I think I know who you're talking about. It was anyway. He did.
Right now,
he wrote a lot of cool stuff about a lot of Bay Area music. But go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, I read that Stan Getz was in town in San Francisco and was living on Nob Hill, and this was news to me because Stan had always been on the road. Stan was based in New York. Stan, but here in the story, the bit that that had made it into the paper was that Stan had a beloved German Shepherd, James, and James got into a fight on the street, and Stan came running, heard the dogs barking, and came running downstairs to break up the dog fight and help out his dog James. And but why it got into the paper was Herb Cain. That's the name of the columnist, Herb Cain, and he was a San Francisco fixture for years. But he wrote about Stan because when Stan came down to break up the dogs, he was dripping wet, having just got out of the shower and stark naked. So that was something for Nob Hill, and it got in the paper, and it caught my attention, and I said, darn, Stan Getz is in town. And I literally called up 411 information and said, do you have a listing for Stan Getz? And they gave me his number. And I called him and said, Stan, I'm thinking about making my summer Stanford workshop. I explained to him a little bit about what I've been doing, making a 1 week long intensive immersion, 1 or 2 weeks long. And was he interested in getting involved? And lo and behold, after 40 years on the road, it turns out he'd been thinking a little bit about music and music education, and he'd never taught, and he wondered if he'd be interested in it. He said, sure, he'd come down. So he invited me, actually, before agreeing, he invited me to come by his place. And at that time, he was actually living in the marina. He'd moved to the marina at that point, which is nearby. So I was living in San Francisco, and I went by and met Stan Getz and started a relationship that lasted from 1981 until his death.
when did you graduate Stanford?
72.
Okay, so essentially, I mean, I'm 38 years old, and I've done a huge amount of work, so many interviews with so many cats from the Bay Area, one of the hottest regional music bastions in the world, and I cannot think of a better year to graduate musically in this country before the drum track, before disco, before really FM radio, freeform radio was thriving. You had Jackson Sutter, you had the Fillmore District. Can you talk about, the abilities for you to play live outside of the academic institution? I mean, I look at it today and I say, so many cats my age and younger are, they're trying to build vocabulary and music in the four walls of academia. And in my mind, there's just no way to do that. You got to be on the bandstand 6-7 nights a week in some upholstered sewer for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And I just want to know, Jim Nadel, where you used to woodshed, in the North Bay or even in Oakland. To me, it was one of the greatest bastions of crossover, cross-pollination of music of all in the history of the world.
Yeah. Well, it was a good time. There were a lot of small clubs. Now we have some more, just like you have in New York City. You have Jazz at Lincoln Center. We've got San Francisco Jazz out here, which is a fantastic organization. They're great for the music. They're not great for the local club scene because the middle level clubs can't really compete. But back in 1972, you had a lot of small places. You had places. Well, of course, you had the Keystone Corner, which was an amazing.
Yeah, but that was a rock club before it was a jazz club. 72 was still run by Freddie Herrera. I'm talking about Chester. I'm talking about Chester Thompson, who was in Tower of Power. Going down and playing, kicking pedals in an organ trio. I mean, I've interviewed every cat from Clifford Coulter. There was a scene in San Jose, and Nadel. I want to know about you. I want to know about you on the bandstand in San Francisco. It's all good. I'm glad that there are philanthropists that are willing to donate to the SF Jazz Center and all that stuff. But before it was, all I'm going to say is this: is that you went to the Jazz Workshop to see Dizzy Gillespie and Roland Kirk before it was Rassan, and that was psychedelic music. So I want to know about Jim Nadel. And you were talking beautifully before about this what I think is so important, because nobody even knows what the word jazz is anymore. And here you have this situation where you wanted to have this cultivation of this society where you could be into different styles, different types of jazz. I think it's just so important. It was breathing back then. I want to know where you fit in.
Yeah. So there were small clubs. There were also, it was possible, they were, even right at the Stanford Shopping Center, there was a restaurant that had music 5 nights a week. And you didn't play pure jazz, but you got to play some jazz, and you got to play some sort of danceable, funky jazz, and you got to actually play music. So that was a beautiful time to be. I was living in San Francisco, and we were all with a group of musicians who were all trying to get better, and you'd practice all day, and then you'd go out at night, and you might even use on the bandstand something that you've been practicing that day.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example?
Let me see. Of something that might have been practicing that used on the bandstand.
I mean, like specifically. Listen, my show is about so my daughters and future generations know how real music is made, and I know after talking to 500 cats from a different generation that music is made just the way you just talked about. So if you could specify it, if you have an example of something that you were woodshedding, go ahead.
All right, so here's the thing.
Yeah.
I go out I have a night, I'm not working, I go out to the club and I hear a saxophone or a trumpet player playing something, and they've got one note that is so fresh every time they use it. And I can't figure out what it is because it's just going by, and I'm, and remember, I'm still kind of a beginner myself. and I'm listening, and then I with my training, I sing that note in my head the next time it comes by, and I think about it, close my ears and think about it in relation to the root of the bass is playing, and I write down something on the cocktail napkin, because this note sounded so fresh in the blues, and so what was it? I get home and I look at this napkin and I see I've written down that a major sixth. Well, that's not a big deal, but the way that it had been used in the blues, where everybody's playing flat sevens and flat threes and stressing that, the sixth came out by withholding it. It came in later on sounding very fresh. So I tried that out, withholding the sixth, then putting it in, and you get this kind of elevated. It's not really doing anything to change the harmony. It's just thickening the stew, but with an interesting flavor if you keep it out and then put it in. And so I try that during the day. I practice it, and that night on my gig, I go out there, and that sound's available to me. It wasn't a complicated sound. It was just one that I hadn't thought about. Here's something I like. How can I get to it? I practice that to figure that out, and then it just becomes part of my language. And it's at this point, it just seems like, well, I can't believe that I ever wasn't aware of how to manipulate that tension and release. But that to be an example. You practice something, then you use it, and then it becomes part of what your bag of tricks or your harmonic vocabulary.
No, this is amazingly. So I mean, because the blues was right alongside the jazz at that time. I mean, were there cats? Were you playing with with the Bishop Norman Williams, or were you playing with Ron Stallings, or were you getting the chance to play with these? I mean, I'm telling you, I've gone across the entire spectrum because you had Chicago, New York, but I mean, L.A. and San Francisco, totally different sounds. It was all regional. There was no interconnection. It was just the most amazing time. And I'd like to know, like, one of these emboldening experiences where you got the chance to play with, cats that, that were, Dewey Redmond or whoever, there were so many people just hanging out.
Well, you mentioned Bishop, and I remember he ran the jam session at the Both And Club, and I frequented that place. I used to go at night and hear the bands, and I heard so many great bands there. Miles many times, and I took my brother, who wasn't hip to jazz at that time. I took him, but he was a trumpet player in the high school band, and later on, I took him to a double bill at the Both And Club with Freddie Hubbard and Lee Morgan. They were splitting the night, and Junior Cook was on saxophone. It was a great night, and my brother got it. You can imagine a trumpet player hearing those two cats play at sort of at their prime. But anyway,
hold on a second. I just want to be clear. They had their own bands playing on the same bill.
Yes.
Because I was going to say,
they alternate sets.
I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better period of time. Junior Cook, Freddie Hubbard band had Kent Brinkley. It had George Cables. That was electric funk jazz. I mean, I don't know who. If you didn't get that, then I mean, it was just the perfect. Anyway, continue on. Yeah, go ahead.
So anyway, and Bishop ran that session, and he was kind to me, letting me sit in because I was a younger cat. There were little clubs. I had my band, and we wrote original material and played in the garage or our living room because we were in San Francisco. And we would get little gigs at places that didn't pay. Like, for instance, there was a club, the Dolphin Club. I don't know if it lasted for a year
was it the Blue Dolphin?
A year and a half.
The Blue Dolphin?
Yeah, that's right, the Blue Dolphin.
Yeah, no, I know it all. Yeah.
And one night we were playing at the Blue Dolphin, and a car pulled up in front, and Dave Liebman jumped out. He was visiting. He was in town. He came into the club, played a tune or two with us, and then took off. And that was just the nature of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Stallings, I got to play with Ron from time to time, and later presented him at Stanford in concert.
Really?
I loved Ron Stallings. Yeah, Ron did a concert. His last concert at Stanford was a concert for peace, where he put together. It was we were at war with in the Middle East, and
the first Gulf War.
Yes,
yeah.
And he put together a strong statement. Brought a lot of musicians together with theme of peace, international.
No, it's funny
peace.
It's funny you bring up the Blue Dolphin, because I was talking to a local musician here in Tucson, where I'm based, and he was out in the Bay Area playing with O.J. Akamode, and he wound up in the Blue Dolphin, and who showed up one night was but the firecracker Jim Pepper. You know, you didn't know.
Oh, wow.
You didn't know who was going to come in. I've already interviewed Liebman for this documentary. I mean, he, by all accounts, he was a latent Stan Getz fan because he was so obsessed with Coltrane at the time. But anyway, it was a brotherhood as well. Did you get a chance to see Stan when you were at the both end? Was that?
Yeah.
Can you?
Well, actually, the first time I saw Stan was at Great American Music Hall, and let me tell you about that in a minute. But I just wanted to throw in one more thing.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was in a band that wrote original material, and we rehearsed way more than we gigged, but we did play some gigs, and eventually we played opening acts at little clubs in Marin, at the Sweetwater up in San Rafael, and I can't even remember the name of the place. And we played in the East Bay. There was a club called the One World Family, and then we played on the Last Day Saloon on Clement Street. We played our little brand of sort of fusion jazz, but with some pretty intense solos. And
do you have tapes of this stuff? I want to hear some tapes of this stuff. I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff because there was the. Go ahead. This is burning stuff. Go ahead.
But we played opening act for Woody Shaw. We played opening act for Jerry Garcia's. He had a Purple Riders of the Sage.
New Riders of the Purple Sage. You opened for them? Wait, hold on for a second. What club?
Some little club on like 4th Street in San Rafael. Teeny place.
And what was the name of your band?
This band was called Sweet Meat.
Sweet Meat. I mean, there was Soundhole with Mario Cipollina. You had Clover with Huey Lewis, who I just interviewed yesterday, was a big Stan fan. And then we had Sweet Meat. I mean, this is unbelievable. You opened for...
So Sweet Meat. So Sweet Meat was... and we actually there was a guy out here named Merle Saunders, Tony Saunders' father.
I've interviewed Tony a bunch of times. Yeah, I know him very well.
Okay. So Tony was the bass player in Sweet Meat, and the guitar player was a guy named Chris Hayes.
Yeah, that's Huey Lewis's cat. Yeah.
And he wrote I Want a New Drug. And the piano player was Bonnie Hayes, who teaches songwriting at Berklee School of Music now. But in any case, so when Merle needed a band, and he didn't have a band, he had a great sax player named Martin Fierro.
Rest in peace.
And so when Merle liked our band, so he needed a band to play with him and Dewey Redman at the Civic Center for some big event, and so he hired our band. So I got to play with Dewey at one point, and that was really an amazing experience. Because Dewey, it was great to stand next to Dewey and Martine and play with those guys.
This is absolutely essential, Jim. This is blowing my mind. Merle had a Stone Jazz gig with Dewey, and your band was opening, and then you had a chance to get. I mean, talk to me about, because Michael Howell, who I love and I've interviewed a bunch of times, he was like, Dewey used to say to him, he'd be playing so out. Way out, and Michael's like, he couldn't get it. And Dewey's like, don't worry, you'll hear it. You'll hear it. But even for me as a non-musician, I still don't necessarily totally understand that. But I mean, can you talk about that experience? Martine had monster chops. I mean, to me, the guy was such a street scholar, but he said such a beautiful tone. And then his flute playing was incredible. Tell me about those cats. Those guys, man, we're missing those cats now, man.
Yeah. Well, those guys, they were something else. And I used to listen to them a lot and go out and hear their band. I'll tell you one thing about Dewey, though. So both of them had patience with me, and Martine gave me a few lessons, and and I remember when we were at the Civic Center with Dewey Redman, which was a big deal for me. It was the biggest venue that I'd ever played, and Dewey was a hero, and so at the break after the sound check, Dewey asked me, he said, "So tell me, what's your biggest problem, your biggest issue as a saxophone player?" And I thought about it, and I told him that right then was I felt that if I tried to take a chance, if I tried to do something that I didn't know if I could do or not, and I pushed it to the limit, sometimes I would lose my place in the form of the song we were playing. So in other words, I would get lost if I tried to do something exciting and different.
Sure.
And so that was a problem, because you want to sort of know where you are. And he said to me, well, what he would do in that situation would be he would just go for the idea, and then if you find out that you don't know where you are, play chromatically until you can hear where you should jump back in. And so that was like
so
that was
cool.
really amazing. He said, go for it, risk it, and if you get lost, fake it until you can hear where you're supposed to land. And so that was, I'd like to hear that from a professional player. The thing, this is a thing I just thought about. I hadn't thought about for years. I used to go hear Merle's organ trio or organ quartet with, I think it was Larry Willis maybe on drums and Martine on saxophone.
No, the Larry Willis, piano player.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
You know who it was? Eddie Moore. Eddie Moore was on drums.
Well, Eddie Moore was on drums. Sorry, Larry Willis is the great piano player, sure.
Yeah.
And Larry came out to Stanford with Stan one time. But Eddie Moore was on drums. But there was a different guy from the Whispers.
Larry Van. Larry Van. I've interviewed them all, Nadel. I've interviewed them all. I mean, 500 interviews. Yeah, no, Larry Van, man. No, it was at one point after this. Merle's band was Martine, Chris Hayes, Larry Van, and Tony.
Yeah.
And Tony. That was the Merle.
Yeah.
And go ahead though. Continue.
Well, so eventually my band Sweetmeat broke up because those guys went with Merle. And then eventually Chris went with Huey Lewis, and anyway. But so the thing was there, and I, by the way, I love Eddie Moore. Eddie Moore is one of the sweetest guys in the world, and I could talk to you about Eddie Moore for a moment. But just to finish the other story, those guys would play. They were playing these fusion jazz tunes, Merle and Martine, things like Little Sunflower or some Stevie Wonder stuff, and it would get down to, they'd take long solos, and I don't know exactly what they were smoking or what they were doing, but it would get down to a drum solo, right?
Yeah, right.
And they're in this drum solo, and Merle can't remember what song they're playing. In other words, he doesn't know when he comes back after the drum solo, he's got to come back into a song, but he can't remember what song it was that they launched the drum solo, unaccompanied drum solo.
Right.
In other words, maybe they were playing Watermelon Man, now it's a drum solo, and you come back into Little Sunflower. That's not as cool as if you came back into the tune that you were playing. And I see him, he's like whispering across the stage to Martine, what song are we playing? Anyway.
Hold on a second.
They got it worked out.
Did you have a chance to see, did you go to the Lion's Share to see Merle's band?
Oh, yeah, sure.
In San Anselmo?
Absolutely.
Because I mean, there was a group, Merle and Martine, and then Jerry Garcia and Billy Kreutzmann was on drums from the Dead. And those groups, and John Kahn was on bass. John Kahn from Michael Bloomfield, and those, they were playing. Eventually, Ron Tutt, the great drummer, came up and used to play with them too. But they were doing the Little Sunflowers and the Freedom Jazz dances. Did you? I mean, but you were going. This was there was a guy named Jimmy. There was a guitar player he used to play with too, Merle. And the organ trios were where? What venues were you seeing them at?
You know, I know there was one off Page Street, I think, in San Francisco. You know, I just don't exactly remember. You've already made my day though. This is beyond the classic stuff. Is that that was the community out there? I mean, do you
Eddie Moore died on the bandstand. Do you want to talk
Yes.
about Eddie for a minute? Because to me, like,
Well,
go ahead.
I'll say this about Eddie Moore is that when he died, we had a benefit for him at Stanford, a memorial celebration, and Joe Henderson came down, and Joe Lovano was there because he was teaching that week, and Jimmy Smith drove in from Sacramento. It was an amazing night. But Eddie Moore was an amazing drummer, of course, and he was. I'll tell you two stories quickly about Eddie Moore. One was I got to play a couple of concerts with him where, for one way or another, I got, hired with some bread, and I got to pick who I wanted to play a concert, and I hired Eddie Moore, we were out to dinner prior to the concert, and we're in a Japanese restaurant, and Eddie Moore starts playing with the chopsticks on like the glassware on the table.
I love this.
And the little ceramic dishes that the sushi gets dipped in.
Oh yeah.
And in a matter of just a couple of minutes, that entire restaurant of about 50 people were all tapping their feet and grooving because this guy.
That is so awesome! What a freaking great! You have no idea. This is my pocket, man. I love it. He was just taking what he had, and he was making. He was. I mean, it really had like it had like like it was a more of like a groove, or was it just sort of just a groove,
just a groove. He had a groove going, but Eddie Moore had the groove, and I played one time. I played a gig with Eddie Moore at the Coffee House at Stanford. That turns out to be, a central, nexus for jazz. And he forgot his bass pedal, and it took a while to get him a bass pedal, but he still got it grooving. But here's the one. One time he showed up for a tuxedo Christmas party gig, and he had forgotten his brushes. Okay, and so maybe he thought it was a regular gig, and he showed up where everybody's in a tuxedo, and we're playing background music at a Christmas party, and a corporate Christmas party, because you have to do these kind of things to make ends meet. And if there's real bread involved, you can call Eddie Moore; he'll come out. And so what does he do? He needs brushes, doesn't have any. Right behind the drums is a big Christmas tree. He reaches back and breaks off two little evergreen branches and uses them for his brushes. But the thing about Eddie Moore is that Eddie Moore, for whatever reason, he looked at me and he just trusted me. And so it put an enormous responsibility on me because, and I think I rose to the occasion in the sense that if any time I called Eddie Moore and asked him to play a gig, if he was free, he said yes. And it could be like I say, Eddie Moore, I've got this corporate Christmas party to play. It pays $500. Do you want to do it? He'd say yes. And I say, Eddie Moore, I've got this coffee house gig to play. It pays $25. Do you want to do it? Yes. And so I had to offer him the ethically correct amount. There's some musicians, no matter what you offer them to play the gig, they're going to ask for $100 more. No matter what it is.
Sure.
If you offer them $400, they'll ask for $500. If you offer them $100, they'll offer $200. Eddie Moore, he just said yes, no matter what it was. So it was up to me, to make sure I offered the correct amount because, I didn't want to take advantage of him, and he wasn't going to negotiate. And I don't know if he was that way with everybody.
That dude, just the fact that, I think I know he played with Sonny Rollins, but I'm trying to remember the familial ties there too, somehow related to. Anyway, my mind is swimming right now. I guess, can you talk about Stan?
Yeah.
As it relates to, can you talk when you brought him in? What kind of teacher was he in terms of was he able to I know he was a very well-read person, and he was an absolutely brilliant person without being formally educated. Obviously, he was with Teagarden, on the road with Tea Garden in ninth grade. Can you talk about his style of presentation, if he was giving a lecture or trying to get a point across or teach something? Can you talk about his ability as a teacher to communicate?
So Stan, for as great a musician as he was, he did not have the formal training. He hadn't been in an academic environment. He didn't have any teaching skills. So if he happened to connect with a musician that they had a natural connection, he was tremendously successful. But there was very few that were like that. So he didn't have any skill set to fall back on. And so one of the things I learned about my community when I was building these communities over the years, because every year I would do this again in the summertime, put together a refreshed community where a lot of ideas were represented, was that you had to have a balance of people that had the nuts and bolts of teaching but that left room for people that were purely just inspirational musicians but could not articulate how they did what they did. Mm-hmm. So if you had to balance Stan, if you had somebody who actually, like, there was a guy, Frank Samaras, locally, who really could explain what he was doing, and he was so good at that you put that together with Stan, who was just a pure inspiration. Or when Stan came out and he brought someone like Jim McNeely or Rufus Reed or Kenny Barron, those were three kind of individuals who actually could do it all. They were inspirational on the bandstand, but also in the classroom. They could really teach. Stan couldn't teach, and I tried to help him teach a little bit, but I think that his sort of restless creative spirit held him back as a teacher, because he felt he wanted to teach it differently every time, just like you might make your solo fresh every time. And it didn't really work. That's too much pressure to put on yourself. Not only am I going to teach this, but I'm going to teach it in a new way.
Could you actually? No, I mean that is what I was expecting to hear. But could you talk about a successful time with a student he did connect with and how he communicated with them, aside from just playing?
Well, so one of the things he did was he tended to be very enthusiastic, or enthusiastically. Really, the word is encouraging. He tended to be encouraging. If somebody he sensed had great talent, then he would be more critical. But in general, he would never say anything critical to your average or your normal player. And I think that was because he didn't have anything to say. Some people would withhold commentary because they were afraid of doing damage. That we had McCoy Tyner out here, and McCoy everybody he'd hear, he'd say, "Oh, that sounds great. Oh, you sound great." He didn't have anything negative to say. And I asked him about this, and McCoy told me it was because one time he had been he listened to a young piano player, and he said he couldn't think of anything to say, so he said, "Well, that thing you do with your left hand, you might want to, clean that up or something, or fix that." And anyway, he just made some offhand comment because he felt he should make a comment, and then 6 or 7 years later, some kid or a young player tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, McCoy, remember you told me this thing 6 years ago? I want to show you what I've done with it." And it was like, it horrified McCoy, because the kid had taken this defect and built it into an entire stylistic foundational thing.
That's
and so McCoy was it's like, oh my goodness, I created something sort of freakish here. So he was just withheld. From then on, he just wouldn't say anything. Stan wouldn't say anything because he didn't know what to say. One time, here's a success. One time there was a kid came in who was young, and Stan said, "Well, play something for me because the kid didn't know anything." And the kid played a Sousa march for Stan, and Stan got all excited and joined in and played the Sousa march and marched around with this kid. And so probably that kid had a great inspirational moment, but it wasn't really about teaching so much. One time we were playing a concert, and there was a good saxophone player, student saxophone player on the concert, and Stan was playing, and it was a noon concert at Stanford outdoors, and the kid played. We were playing Wave. That's a Jobim bossa nova,
Sure.
and And it's a nice tune. It's got a mixture of blues and colorful chords. And the very first chord of the song is a major seventh. It's a D major seventh chord. And in jazz, you can play a blues sound anywhere in jazz. And if it doesn't fit the chord, it fits idiomatically. So you can play a blues sound, which is a minor kind of a sound. You can play it over a major chord, and it sounds okay in jazz. The clashes that you hear from the minor sound of the blues being superimposed over the major sound, those clashes are sort of idiomatic to jazz, and they're acceptable. But they are a contrast. They are a conflict, a dissonance, but it's a good dissonance. So this kid always played over the big major seventh chord. He played a blues scale, a blues idea, and so as Stan later on, Stan said to me, "Hey, I have a lesson with this kid coming up, but I've been listening to him play, and I don't really have anything to tell him. What do you have any ideas? Because I'd heard him play." And I mentioned to Stan, well, you might tell him that, like when he's playing a tune like Wave, and he plays that blues scale over the major chord on the first measure, that works and it's fine, but it's only one color that's available. It's kind of like saying you're missing the beauty of the possibility of sometimes playing a major seventh sound, which is a lovely sound. And if you always treat it just as a blues because you never try anything new, you're going to miss that possible color. And now Stan has big ears. Stan would hear the possibility of that major seventh, and he would do it. And once I pointed that out to him, he went, "Oh yeah, okay, that's something that makes sense to Stan." He just couldn't articulate it. And so I said, it's kind of like you're going down the freeway and it says scenic overlook ahead. You don't have to get off and take that scenic overlook, but you can. It's available to you. That major seventh sound is available to you. You don't always have to play it blues. You can play it blues some of the time, and sometimes you could let it blossom like a major seventh flower. Anyway, Stan told me later he mentioned that to the kid in the lesson, and it was eye-opening to the kid. So once Stan, if someone could have coached him a little bit, I think he could have developed his teaching skills. He just didn't. He didn't have enough time and experience to know the kinds of things he could even be helped. Stan is self-taught. Stan's an intuitive. Stan plays by ear and
absolutely.
sings.
No, I wanted to ask you about him verbalizing the idea of this gypsy Russian Jewish heritage that he had growing up on the streets of the Bronx, and here he is at this prestigious institution like Stanford. Can you talk about the way he felt about getting to a point in the twilight of his career? There's no doubt. I mean, he had not been totally afflicted with huge amounts of health issues when he first started, but he could see his mortality. But can you talk about the pride that he felt being that he came as a street scholar, working his way up to an institution like Stanford?
Well, I think he was really proud to be here and to be with. I mean, because he could be super charming, and he was with the professors that he hung out with at Stanford. I think he loved being part of that scene, but he was at heart, so streetwise, and he had sort of a lot of instincts. Like sometimes, I think of like his German Shepherd James. They had a lot in common. They're kind of always sniffing around for food or sex or whatever. And but Stan, there was something you said at the beginning. I'm just trying to get back to that. Well, I think he was certainly happy to be part of the scene. For him, it was sophisticated, and they were really nice people, really good people that were trustworthy, and they weren't trying to take advantage of him.
And they recognized. I'm just trying to get at the idea that he had to go on the road at ninth grade because he had to support his family, and the idea of being the pride that he had, if he ever shared the kind of pride that he felt based on his upbringing and where he came from.
Not so much with me. He talked about it. Stan Stan was a complicated guy, and there was a lot of stuff going on with Stan. But with me, I remember that. Let me just throw out one thing, because this was where you had started going for. I'll talk about how Stan and I related, but which was a little different than the way he related with the Stanford community in general. But when you talked about him in the classroom, the classic quote, and I heard him say this more than once because he liked it. You know, it was very popular after Miles did his 1959 Kind of Blue recording. People talked a lot about modes, and Bill Evans had given us, written them down, and a lot of composers were using modal concepts as a kind of reaction to bebop. Stan was all about the feeling. What does it feel like? What is the groove like? What is the sonority? What is the warmth of the sound? And Stan was not somebody who thought so much about. He knew about a G7 sharp 11 flat 13. He knew what that sounded like, but he didn't think about this is what it's called. And there are other musicians who would think about this is the name of that sound. Stan wasn't all into that. Stan could hear it. He had fantastic ears, but he didn't know the names of these sounds. But he used to say, and the quote was, "It's not the mode, it's the mood." And that speaks volumes for how Stan approached.
Unpack that for the non-musician.
Okay, so it's not about the theory of what is going on in the note choice. It's about what is being communicated. It's what's the feeling. It's the mood. And so the thing about Kind of Blue, he didn't say this, but I'm relating it to Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. It doesn't matter that So What is the Dorian mode modulating chromatically by half step from D minor to E flat. What matters is that the whole album has a feeling that unites all the songs and it makes you feel a certain way, and that's what Stan was tuned into. How does this music make you feel? What's being communicated? Not he liked, and that's hard to talk about, but that's kind of the wavelength he was.
I dig. No, this is amazing, really. I mean, you talk about the time. I guess what you took away from Stan as, if you could compare him to an artist of another medium, a sculptor or a painter, knowing that he was insecure and very sensitive, had some kind of personality. He probably had bipolar and was a heavy substance abuser. Knowing all the factors of his personal side, is there an artist that you could, could make an analogous comparison to?
I'm a little. I don't know. Stan is unique in my world.
Why is he unique?
I had just never met anybody that was had such a strong and compelling sound on their instrument that just seemed to go directly to my heart. And I think that's why he was well received in the world, is that people just could. Music speaks beyond beyond words and beyond. There's a certain part of our mind that music can access that you just can't access directly. I don't know. I'm sure there are other ways, and I'm sure there are visual artists that do that for people, but I don't have that experience as powerfully as I do with music. One time I was listening to Arthur Rubinstein at the Opera House in San Francisco, sitting way up in the balcony, and I was listening so intensely, and at some point I realized that tears were streaming down my face, and I had no idea. I hadn't felt anything sad, and I had no idea what had really happened, except that somehow the music had come in some back door of my brain and triggered something. And anyway, so music is kind of there's some direct levels of access to some deep part of our humanity that I don't know of any other way to get there. And I'm quite sure you talk to somebody like, if you would have talked to Nate Oliveira, Joey's father, or someone like that, they would maybe be able to make that analogy.
A lot of cats have given really, Lalo Schifrin said Degas. A lot. I mean, listen, this is just something where it's like, I mean, Stan had a Mozartian as far as musical qualities, just as far as time, feel, and tone, and so many things, and from an early age. I guess what I'm trying to get at also, I really am fascinated, when did he ever give interviews? Did he ever when was he most comfortable articulating? Was it on the bandstand during performances? I know he could be very charming to the audience. It didn't matter if he was coked up or not. He could be talking, introduce the songs, give some background. Can you talk about when he was most loquacious? Because I know that you brought him in because of his pedigree, but I mean, when was he most comfortable in a setting where he could express himself verbally?
As a teacher, I don't really know if that happened.
Wow.
Every now and then there would be some student who was just at the right place at the right moment to hear what Stan had to say. I remember there was a kid that was playing the major seventh on a dominant chord, okay? And at the end of his solo, Stan made some comments. Said, you play the one note in there, it just doesn't sound right. To me, it's and it's true. You can play a major seventh on a dominant and make it work. Millions of people do it. Charlie Parker did it. Stan did it. But if you play it the wrong place rhythmically, it sounds like fingernails on a blackboard. And so this kid was doing that, was oblivious. Stan pointed it out, and that was great. And then they play another song, and the kid did it again, and Stan pointed it out, like, hey, I just told you to watch out for that, and you're not watching out for it. And then they played another song, and the kid did it again, and Stan just stopped the band and said, and got heated about it for a moment. Well, I'm sure that kid really thought about being a little more careful about what he was playing from that moment on. Now, is that good teaching? Well, it's probably effective in this one moment. Stan, the best teaching that Stan did was not where he articulated, where he spoke verbally. The best teaching was on his instrument. I remember that, there's one time we had a combo that I was leading. It was a mixture of students. It was kind of a beginning level group. They weren't beginning players, but they were mostly new to jazz. So you might have had a classical flute player who had pretty phenomenal technique, but didn't know anything about improvisation. And maybe there was a rock guitar player who did what he did well in rock, but he was checking out jazz. So there were some Stanford students that were in this group that I put together a combo, and Stan was making a visit. And they're playing a tune. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Freddie Hubbard's tune called Straight Life.
Sure.
But it's got a vamp, 2 repeating chords. So it's pretty simple form. It's not like playing a bebop tune where there's a lot of harmonic navigation. You're just sort of in one key area for the whole time. So it's easy to get started in a tune like that because you don't have to process a lot of changes. And so these kids were all sort of stretching out. And then we're going around the room, and each one's taking 4 bars, trading with Stan. So the student would play, Stan would play. Then the next student would play, and Stan would play. Then the next student would. We go around the circle like that. And after he'd been around once, trading 4s with the students, he had sort of picked up on each of these 7 or 8 students' musical personalities. Like the flute player always played these sort of heroic classical improvisations, and the blues player played these bluesy ones, and the guitar player played these rock ones, and the beginning bebop player played these fledgling bebop kind of ideas. And the second time he went around, when Stan answered each person, he made some musical comment on what they had thrown out, the content of what they'd thrown out, but he also at the end of the phrase, turned it into the style of the person that was coming up next. So he commented on the person who was playing and set up the next person. So he ended up setting up the classical player with some little classical type idea at the end of his four. And it was just so brilliant that he could go around the room. It was like playing chess with four people at the same time, that kind of thing. It was just great. It was so thrilling and inspiring to see somebody that was that fluid and could retain that much in his mind about each person.
Yeah, and so can you talk about how you know that was an effective teaching style with the students?
I think that it was effective because people were inspired and thrilled by because everybody could, after a moment, pick up on what was going on, and it was such a display of musical brilliance, and it was that they could understand. They could see right there. You know, if you don't know the jazz form, if you don't know what's going on, you might not appreciate the brilliance as completely. But here, everybody could see, wow, he's actually doing this right before our eyes, and they were totally inspired. And just that kind of inspiration is, you could feel it in the air. It was almost, this excitement was palatable.
Well, I love that. That's a great. I love these sort of outside these different modes and ways of. People talk to me about, my show's peaking really now after 5 years, and my tentacles are so far out on new media because I disseminate all these stories, like the stuff you're talking about with Sweet Meat. It's like, I'm friends with all the musicians. I've crossed that threshold as far as credibility is concerned, but I haven't read any history books. I've done long form interviews with, everybody from Charles Lloyd to Bobby Hutcherson, rest in peace, to Bill Cosby to Jim Nadel. And you guys have been the ones to not just paint the picture of history, but promote how you don't, it's not all uniform. Not everything, there's not all uniformity. There's not just one way to do it. I think I'd like you to talk about the idea of, give an example of, I just talked to Mel Martin, one of your comrades over there, a couple days ago. He talked to you. You guys work very closely. Put the screws to Joshua Redman quite a bit, I think. And here's the thing. It's like, it's pretty easy now for cats to develop a lot of technical chops. I mean, there's a lot of information available. It's obviously not hard to do. Stan really was like, he literally just used his ears and feel. It didn't matter if it was a Dave Holland tune or a Chick Corea tune. It was like, let's just burn. I don't need to see the charts. And here it is. Obviously, he had gifts, but can you talk about a time in his time at Stanford when, he went up there with a situation where it was, he also, the idea that he used his old school improvisatory attitude, which was he didn't hear something, and if he didn't hear it, he wasn't going to play. And he allowed the other musicians to come in and fill that in, and then when he felt it, he would come in and play. To me, it's like that stuff is also very inspiring because it's totally an old school kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He never played any. He had a real commitment to being meaningful when he played, and he never played. I never heard him play a bad note, and I never heard him play anything that was insincere. And it is interesting because for me, there was the Stanford community, which is really can be a lovely community, and he's hanging out with professors, with Nobel laureates, with people that are renowned in their academic fields. When he hung out with me, he connected with there was also another level, which was more that how musicians backstage might talk about things, and there was a crude humor that by today's norms would be very incorrect. That was that was going on.
Can you at least explain a little bit about what they were bantering about?
Well, just in his attitudes towards the way that he would talk about people and life and women, and it's really not anything I think that he would want to be. He would be proud of his legacy, to have that. But in fact, he was like a cat who he had he liked to laugh, and he liked off-color remarks and jokes, and was kind of a treasure trove of them himself. I think that there was a lot of entertaining, sort of, backstage humor that went on, and
well, it was also. I know. Listen. They'd poke fun at. Listen. Cal Jader's band at one point. You probably saw at the both end. Johnny Hurd had a stuttering problem. Dick Burke weighed 350 pounds. Mike Wolf had Tourette's syndrome. Cal drank himself. Nobody cared. Nobody took themselves that seriously, and they poked fun at their ethnic heritages or this, that. So that it was a less PC time. That's not. So continue.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm just saying that I forget what our direction is here.
No, it was a backstage banter with Stan you were talking about.
Yeah. So it was always. Some people would find it really, really funny, and a lot of people would if they heard it, would find it hugely offensive. But I can handle anything like that, and to me, I was fascinated by the fact that the contrast with this man who could be like that streetwise, smart German shepherd about so much of his life, and on the other hand, could step out on stage, and it was like channel or play stuff of exquisite beauty. Stan played beautifully. I can't think of another musician that could sustain that level of warmth and beauty in their playing, and it was a contrast to the way he behaved much of the time.
Can you in your own personal opinion explain that contradiction? That to me is the crux of why this film should go to Cannes Film Festival. What you just said.
I don't really know it. For me, it was an awakening, because I used to always think that the art was just an expression of the person, and clearly it probably was. Which means that inside of Stan there was this really beautiful spirit, but because of his insecurities and because of whatever, his substance abuse and how that reacts, I don't pretend to know. It was hidden, but I think there was something really beautiful in the man. And in any case, it made me think for a while, well, gosh, maybe he's just a vessel that's channeling something. And I don't mean to demean it. It's just a vessel. He did a lot of hard work to get the skills to be able to communicate that way. But the artistic choices that he made and the direction he took are unique.
So it was an awakening. Can you go back to this awakening? It was an awakening because it changed.
Yeah. I always thought, gosh, you're an artist and you express who you are as a human being. But for Stan, they seem to be two different things. The guy that could be a devil backstage, or screaming or shouting or being self-indulgent or charming, whatever, get out on stage and it was always good. It was always from the heart. It was always powerful. I've heard of performances that were subpar that he did. I just never witnessed anything like that. Every time he put the horn into his mouth,
yeah.
It was just great.
What did you can you talk about in your upbringing? Obviously you were kind of a you graduated in the early 70s, and that was, did you get off on Focus? Did you get off on the Boston pop stuff? Did you hit the bossa nova stuff? Were you into his bebop stuff? Can you talk about what, the stuff that because I mean, to me, it's like the bossa stuff gets all the publicity, and it's really cool because he was on the pop charts and he knocked the Beatles off the pop charts, and it was one of the very few jazz tunes that ever made it into popular music, and he was a rock star. But the guy was a freaking bebop genius, and Lalo Schifrin said that Dizzy thought that, like Charlie Parker, a different sound totally, but he added his own vocabulary to bebop. So where does Nadel come in as far as where you think what kind of albums were on your radar before he came to Stanford?
Yeah, well, early on in my life, when I was a kid, when I was growing up, my mom had brought home some mainstream jazz albums because she didn't really know. My family didn't listen to jazz, but she did bring home the bossa nova records, and I remember playing my saxophone as a teenager, trying to play along with Desafinato and like that. And we also had some Brubeck in the house. But then when I got into high school, a friend played for me in the same year. I heard for the first time Coltrane and Sonny Rollins and Jimi Hendrix. So that was my big eye-opening moment or ear-opening moment. And then I got into, a lot of, eventually worked my way back. I got into, the 60s Coltrane, and then eventually worked my way back into Bird. And I wasn't that hip to Stan, though I knew about his bossa nova stuff. And I went and saw him one time at the Great American Music Hall. He was playing with Billy Hart on drums. I was just thinking about this because I worked with Billy Hart this summer, but and I was sort of astonished by the man. He was having some drinking issues then. I remember he was playing beautifully, and he's playing tunes like Colin Alma, and but I remember watching him play, and Stan played with his eyes open, and I could sort of see from my balcony spot. I could see that. He was tracking. Have you ever been in the Great American Music Hall?
I wish. I mean,
yeah,
no, but no. Yeah, go ahead.
The point is, it's a large, long room. It's odd for a club in that it's so long. The distance from the bar to the stage is like half a block or something.
Yeah, right. Well, they want to keep the riff-raff away. They want people locked into the music, right?
So he's there playing on the stage, and he's looking out over this big room, and I can see he's tracking something. And there's a waiter leaves the bar with a tray with one cocktail on it. And Stan is just watching this drink move above the heads of all the patrons, and it walks all the way down this long room right up to the bandstand. And in the middle of his solo, Stan stops and takes the drink off the tray and has a big, long sip of it, So he was like, I said, wow, what's up with this guy? He's playing this beautiful solo, and he just stops in the middle to have a drink. It's
wow. I mean, did the rhythm section just keep going?
Yeah, the rhythm section kept going.
Because he used to slug down, neat shots at full glasses of. Helen Merrill was telling me, just full shots of Jack or a Scotch. So I mean, he just took a swig off that and then just put the horn back in his mouth and kept blowing.
Yeah, like that. Yeah. So what a thing. People have their who knows what's going on in his head. But anyway, they played great, and then I got some records, of him, like the Sweet Rain record, and some, and I sort of worked my way back. So I didn't early on in life I didn't realize the depth of his music. But those when some of the stuff he did, I got to hear him so much live because he came to Stanford with so many great bands. I mean, brought so many wonderful musicians, and I was there even for some of the transitions. Stan, he would take advantage of people a little bit, get them to do favors for him, and I guess he was just used to that. The very first time I met him, I said, Stan, not the first time I met him. When he got the academic appointment, I told him, Stan, so I'm going to be your liaison with the Department of Music. And he said, "Oh, that's great. So you're going to help me out? That's great." And he said, "So look, could you go downtown and pick up my dry cleaning because it's done now?" And I said, "Fuck you, Stan."
Yeah, right.
And he just grinned at me. And it was all fine. From then on, we were cool. But nonetheless, he did do stuff like when he was going to go play at the White House with
Chick Corea, Miroslav, and Roy Haynes, and Diane Shure.
Yeah. So he said to me, "Jimmy, can you write me an arrangement of this tune for Itzhak Perlman, me, and a rhythm section?" And it was some tune, "With You I'm Born Again" or something like that. Or anyway, he gave me the recording, and I wrote this arrangement for him because I thought he wanted. He didn't pay me, and I just did it, because I thought that was a big deal. And then when he got back from the White House, I said, "Hey, did you use that arrangement?" He said, "Oh no, Itzhak wanted to play Summertime." So whatever, that was fine, And one time when Jim McNeely left the band, there was a tune they were playing called Blood Count. And it was Billy Strayhorn tune, and Jim had these exquisite voicings. The way he played the chords, the notes he chose, the way he spread them out on the keyboard were so exceptional. And Stan knew that Jim was leaving the band, or maybe he had left the band, and Kenny Barron was coming on. And Stan said to me, asked me if I could I transcribe off the record, write down the chord voicings that Jim had used so that he could show them to Kenny Barron, because he's afraid that that tune, which he really liked, wouldn't sound good without Jim's voicings. So I don't know. It didn't seem like that important to me, but, I did that for him, and then he never even used it. Kenny Barron showed up, and they played the tune, and Kenny had his own voicings, which were gorgeous in a different way, but they were just beautiful. And so, Stan would ask for these favors that he might or might not use just to have something in his pocket. And I didn't mind doing that for him a bit on a musical level. But he did find someone to get his dry cleaning, and he would find someone to do this, that, or the other thing for him. He would just put his charm out there and manipulate people.
Yeah, and I think that really kind of, to me, that would just be a demoralizing thing especially if I idolized somebody like that and looked up to them. I've had those situations before. It's like, really? It almost shows a lack of respect. Although, did you find him to be, only willing to work with cats that were really were really at a point where they could really learn something? Did he? I know he didn't have a lot of tolerance for people that weren't smart. He was such a genius that I think did you see him take it out on students or not want to work with certain kids? Because Olivero told me he's like that if they weren't up to snuff, Stan wasn't going to be with them.
Yeah, he basically only really related well to a small percentage of students. But he was cordial and charming with the others. So I never saw him take it out on anybody. The only one he would ever take it out on was a student he thought had real talent.
Could you give an example of what he did, like with a student that he thought had real talent and how he would take it out on them?
Well, I think he would just be complimentary and encouraging. But then if somebody he thought had talent, he would tell them that he thought they needed to work more. That they weren't realizing their potential. And that it wasn't, it took hard work and you're going to have to, spend more time on it. That would be the way he would take it out on him. He could get annoying. I told you about that one kid with the major seventh on the dominant chord. Stan just got annoyed. It annoyed him.
Can you talk about how he would be, even with ones that, cats that weren't, in the top tier, how he would be charming with them, so that it's nice to know that he wouldn't. Can you just talk the kind of the stuff he would talk about to charm them?
I think he would just say that sounds good, or something like that. He didn't really have a lot. He was just his demeanor. He was smiling. He was he was not judgmental. he made people try to make people relax, and I mean he, so much. Stan was relaxed when he played. It was like some kind of. I mean, well, that's the way the music sounds, don't you think? Doesn't it sound like it's coming from a place of real relaxation?
Absolutely. I mean, it's Mel said it's like it sounded like magic. It just didn't sound like. It certainly wasn't planned, and I just love the idea that it was really just totally improv. I feel like he was a huge inspiration to so many people who just not just wanted to create. I mean, Stan was not a great songwriter by any means. He didn't compose a lot, but just the even Huey yesterday in the interview with Huey, and we had such a ball, and he's talking about this guy Seymour Red Press, who's a Broadway contractor now, and he grew up with Stan. They knew each other since they were 6 years old, and but the point was that Huey's like, when I finally found a tune that I thought Stan could play on, I mean, he's like, I didn't want to just give him 16 bars. I wanted this guy to be able to blow. Because, I mean, the sequencing of the ideas and the amount of ideas and the amount of stuff was just insane. It just kept coming and coming and coming. I never saw him. I missed the boat. But to hear him and then really to know to know that he was such a competitor and loved to get on stage with Sonny Stitt and Dizzy, and Don Menza said one time, this is Johnny Griffin, someone said to Johnny, hey, Stan Getz is playing at a club in Chicago. They were in Chicago. He's like, why don't you go down there and cut him, like make him look bad. And Johnny Griffin goes, well, I'll go down and play with him. He's like, you don't cut Stan Getz. The respect from, what do you think haunted Stan the most? I mean, what did he confide in you the most? What frustrated him? People would say to me, let's see, who was I talking to? Someone the other day said, Richie Byrack said, the thing that I made Stan irate is when he walked into a hotel somewhere in Europe, or it could have been anywhere, and they didn't know who Stan Getz was, and it made him furious. It was like, they were he was used to the champagne and the best hotel rooms and all he could be comfortable in the fact that people respected and understood his genius, but nothing irritated him more than when they didn't know who he was. But I'm just curious if, I know the stories about, Dizzy showing up at Stanford for a reunion concert, and Stan freaked out and did not show up for the concert and wound up, everybody's in the house he's got a gun, and what do you think haunted Stan the most? I mean, knowing that he wasn't autistic by any means, but he really had such an unorthodox way of teaching. What did you think haunted him the most?
Well, the thing I don't have any way to judge is how much this, getting free, his battle with substance abuse, his battle with alcohol in particular, how much of that had to do with the way he behaved at any moment. Because, if you're in withdrawal, that's going to make you a different person or whatever. And,
sure.
And you hear all these things. People say, yeah, when you get sober, it doesn't make you be any nicer. It just makes you sober, But with Stan, the thing that surprised me the most there is that for all this, he had a gift. He had some kind of magical gift. Not to say that he didn't put in a ton of work. He had to have practiced, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day for years, as a kid to get this, to be able to do what he did. To play the saxophone that well, you had to have put in a lot of time. So he put in his time. But he also, there's that intangible thing. So there was some gift where he was able to relax or able to focus or tune out the world, whatever it was, enough when he played. He had some kind of, but he also had a great insecurity about it. To him, it seemed so natural and easy that he didn't value it, and he was constantly worried. I remember when I hired Joe Henderson, and Joe Henderson had some popular records and whatnot at that time in his life, and Stan was worried about Joe Henderson. And then he heard Joe Henderson play, and he totally relaxed. Oh, okay, I'm not worried anymore. Joe sounds good, but that doesn't trouble me. He was afraid to teach. He got stage fright. He was nervous every time he went to play. He doubted his own talent. And why would that be? Why would a guy who is that strong, that powerful, that complete of an artist have self-doubt? He had tremendous insecurity. And so every now and then that would be revealed to me, where he was shaky or scared or almost in tears because he was worried that he wasn't a good enough musician or a good enough artist when he's like the best that the world has to offer.
Could you give a specific time when you saw that?
I remember one time when I was so happy because John Chowning from the music department at Stanford was there and helped me through this. But Stan was almost in tears because he didn't think that he was capable of playing, meaningful music. And it's like, I'm thinking, is this guy just on alcohol withdrawal, or what do you say to somebody, And John helped talk him down, or helped me. I wasn't alone dealing with him, but Stan was really upset because he didn't think that he had it as a musician, that he was a phony or something like that.
Wow.
And it just was astonishing to me. And I saw him, and the thing with Dizzy, Stan went up there and tried to give a lecture. And again, like I said, he didn't want to repeat himself. If I suggested an idea, it was like he couldn't use that idea because it wasn't authentic. Somebody else had suggested it, he was approaching it with sort of this artistic integrity, which was impressive. But
he got up and did the lecture, but he fell apart, or something like that.
Well, for instance, so he had bad judgment about what he hadn't heard enough lectures, And in a lecture, there's a lot of different ways you can do it, but the standard way is you tell him what you're going to tell him, you tell it to him, and then you recap what you said, But Stan couldn't get with that. And, I remember, for instance, this time it was either the first or the second lecture. Just that week he had read some book about pyramids and how if you slept inside of a pyramid, it would focus your energy. And pyramids was this mystical form of energy. It was sort of this self-help du jour kind of book that was popular for maybe 2.5 weeks in the world, and Stan happened to have read it. So he gets up and he says, I was thinking about putting this in the lecture. I said, Stan, that's not for the lecture. That's some hippie science that is going to be here, gone tomorrow, And so said, oh, you really think so? Yes, Stan. There's nothing there that you need for this, Talk about your international influences and did the jet age influence the music, because now CDs could come from Brazil to San Francisco, or whatever. And so he gets up there on stage, and at some point, somebody asked him something in the audience. What do you think about the influence of the bossa nova and the jet age and this and that? Do you think it had any effect? He just said no. Next question, and it was like that. Okay, so then he gets frazzled at some point, and he pulls out of his pocket this book review from, well, who knows, maybe it was I don't know what it's from, of the Pyramid book, and he just starts reading it. And he reads from this newspaper clipping about the power of pyramids in your life energy, for too long on stage, when he's supposed to be talking about his life in jazz and the meaning of music. And anyway, it was just uncomfortable for him. He starts sweating and feeling nervous, and the audience is like, what's going on here? Even if he did want to talk about pyramids, he should give a synopsis of it. He shouldn't read the article.
This is this is so classic. It's not linear. Maybe it makes no sense at all. But he did have. Listen. Benson Wong. He was like a clairvoyant specialist for Stan, and used to talk to him about the color schemes that he would see the alpha state.
Okay.
Did Stan talk to you about the alpha state and the?
Yeah, a little bit. I remember Stan telling me about the alpha state. Yeah.
Can you?
And that he was in the
tell me
alpha
about
state more than other people. No, I just remember that Stan telling me that there's certain things that Stan had told me, like that. I thought he told me that Duke Ellington, or maybe it was Bob Brookmeyer, said that Stan was the most intuitively talented musician they'd ever met. Oh, he said that Duke said that after they played at the White House, and Bob Brookmeyer made some comment like that too. But I heard these things from Stan, and Stan also told me that somebody, and maybe it was this Wong guy, said that Stan existed in the alpha state more than was normal, and I don't know anything about that, but I heard that from Stan. Maybe he was proud of that and told me. But
what was what was that to him? What was the alpha state?
I think that was maybe that was his creative flow. I always assumed it was.
I wonder I wonder if he was trying to, in his own way, even though he didn't have it all put together, he was trying to talk about that pyramid thing, less about
maybe.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. That who knows?
He didn't have it worked out,
Right.
and so it was okay. It wasn't a bad thing to do. It was just the skill set of the way that he framed it and delivered it made him and everybody listening uncomfortable. So his lectures weren't that great, and then he went to hear. He showed up for Dizzy's lecture, and here Stan's had a couple of lectures over a couple of different years, and they haven't been so exciting. And then Dizzy comes in there, and Dizzy just starts telling stories, and he's relaxed and natural, and he's funny, and he takes out his his mouth harp and starts boinging away and getting the audience to sing along, and it's like everybody's having a good time, and Dizzy's got him in the palm of his hand. And Stan has a lecture coming up the next week, or the next night or something, and he just saw Dizzy give a little lesson in how to, be comfortable on stage with a whole room full of people and chatting, and Stan felt really inadequate because he knew that he couldn't do that, or he didn't know how to do that, and so that's when he fell off the wagon and didn't show up to the concert with Dizzy, and took out a gun and scared everybody and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it was like he could not really handle the responsibility or the insecurity of coming up short, and he would take it out on other people. He did that a lot to his family as well. Jim, I want to do part 2 with you. I just, if you can hang on the phone for a minute, I want to wrap this interview up and then talk to you off air for a minute. We've been cooking for an hour and a half here.
Oh, is that right? Okay, great.
All right, hold on one second. This is Jim Nadel. Thank you so much for being part of the program today on Power Talk. This was a worldwide broadcast, and you rocked out, man, and I look forward to doing it again real soon.
Great. Thank you for having me.